Well, hello everybody, and welcome to Thinking Aloud. Today on Thinking Aloud, we're joined by Charlie Luxton, someone who just doesn't design buildings, but invites us to think differently about what they are and how they could be. So Charlie is, as many of you will know, is widely recognised for fronting television programmes like Building the Dream and Homes by the Sea. But beyond the screen lies an ambition to question really how we design, build, and how the decisions shape the way which we live. So I'm delighted to have Charlie with us today, but there's lots to talk about. Charlie, really, as a designer, a communicator, and an advocate, which is what I know him mostly for in construction. He's been working across architecture, media, and public discourse, and that's from everything from sketching ideas to presenting on camera, speaking at events. And Charlie has a wonderful habit of asking questions that many in the industry leave unasked about everything from planning policy to affordability to the role of architecture in responding to the climate crisis. So what makes him a compelling guest for us on Thinking Aloud is not just the strength of his ideas, but the fact that what he has done has delivered results. Charlie and his businesses have been multi-award-winning businesses, recognised and receiving widespread praise for not only design quality, but for ambition and translating the thinking that he brings to bear into the broader industry. So in today's conversation, we're not just going to revisit Charlie's work, I'm sure we'll touch on it, but we're going to explore the thinking behind it and look at how Charlie approaches regulation, build quality, performance gaps, passive house, we'll look at healthy buildings, etc. So we've got plenty to talk about, Charlie. And first off, welcome. I know that you've got a Glastonbury hangover because you've been away all weekend.
Yeah, I did just before we got online, I said, well, if I sort of glaze over or go a bit hoarse, it's just because I've had a rather fun time in Somerset. So no, that was very good, but I'm sure we'll get through it.
We'll be as understanding as we can be.
That's so kind of you. That's so kind of you.
So Charlie, listen, I'm sure you know what we do on these podcasts on Thinking Aloud and what we talk about. And really the objective here is to explore some of the thinking that goes on behind, which isn't necessarily codified, but influences and sort of, instructs the way that we behave. And you have always been pretty frank about how the construction sector talks a good talk, okay, especially on circularity, but it largely fails to deliver, is the message that we're getting back. So lots of talk is what Greta Thunberg would call blah, blah, blah. When you publicly call people on this, what's the normal reaction? Do you get people going, "Oh, I never looked at it like that before," or is there resentment, or how does it go because you become, on numerous occasions I've seen you challenge people. What's the sort of feedback you get from these people when you do challenge them on something, or pick a topic, or pick something that you have?
So I think the circularity one's really interesting in that, you say we should reuse stuff and everyone goes, oh yeah. And you go, and if you reuse stuff and we get the systems working, it will be a lot cheaper. They go, oh yeah. And if we get the scale and we get it all working, we can get regulation, we can get contract elements sorted, all the difficult, gritty stuff because we're doing it in our work. So it's possible. And they go, oh yeah. And they go, so what about you guys? Oh yeah, no, because actually it takes a lot of effort to get it started. And I think there's a real problem that you've got to push extra hard to make things move to begin. You've got all that inertia to get things moving. And I think, unfortunately, there is not enough, you need both carrots and sticks to make it happen. Everyone understands it's a really good idea. Yes, there are more costs in terms of, will you bring down bricks, one hand by hand, brick by brick or whatever, clean them off and send them to site. And yes, there's some more cost in that, but only if you ignore all the other costs of if you get a brick and burn a brick and produce all the carbon. And actually, it just comes down to really bad accounting. In nearly all of these situations, it comes down to very bad accounting and siloed thinking. So we don't put enough value into the things that don't sit neatly on our spreadsheets. And so when you're asking someone to change what they do and the benefits fall outside their spreadsheet, they go, yeah, it's a brilliant idea. And then they don't do it pretty much always, right? Because we are driven by that.
I mean, this is an obsession of mine, has been what you can't put on a spreadsheet matters, So if the job is 100%, and you can put 80% of it on the spreadsheet. The 20% you can't is often the most influential part and the biggest sponsor of change. But I'm intrigued by this as well, because a lot of what you suggest is actually common sense. You say it to people, and it's kind of difficult to argue against.
Yeah.
Why would you not do that? So why? I mean, what do we think about why good ideas fail, especially in reuse and circularity? There's lots of really good, sensible ideas, just never get any traction.
Well, I think the reuse and circularity thing is that the regulatory system is completely set up not to understand it. Structural engineers, the whole of our construction industry has been moving increasingly to become completely codified, right? And if something isn't easy to codify, they don't want to use it. So, for example, the whole use of the Building Safety Act is now, we are literally tearing our hair out with the Building Safety Act, because, to understand what a 30-minute fire system is and a 60-minute fire system, or a fire door, it's now not that the hinges are fire doors and the handles are fire door and the blanks are fire door and the way that you put it together is a fire door. Oh no, because that hasn't been tested as a complete system. That hinge might not have been used with that handle, and therefore, actually, you shouldn't use it. So we've just managed to completely codify everything, so the only people that can sell you things, pretty much, unless you've got a pretty, enlightened building control officer, or although in the end of the day you now have to sign off on that thing that you're happy to take that slight risk, is you can only use systems. Now clearly that means you can only use systems that are coming through the regulatory sort of frameworks, and that just puts all of this innovation. I don't know how it's going to happen. Genuinely, I do not know how innovation is going to happen at the pace and speed that we need it with what is coming with the Building Safety Act, and that genuinely keeps me up at night. It keeps me up on so many levels, because now we are massively responsible for our buildings for 30 years, not 12 years, as we have been up until recently. Massively keeps me up at night that we're supposed to sign off at the end of a job to say that this building is exactly built like to meet the building safety standards. It's like, well, we weren't on site. I drew all the stuff. I don't know if the fire liners went. I don't know. So what? I need to be a clerk of works, and no one knows. Yet this thing is just trundling. I was going to hold off getting onto Building Safety Act, but I actually can't, because it is. I'm
going to make it worse, Charlie, because I'm just going to put a bit more gasoline on the fire with this. It's not just about stifling innovation; it's stifling people building better anyway.
Yep.
And so we know that. So one of our products we're putting through fire testing, it's a roof covering, it's a roof slate, it's a recycled roof slate called Eco Slate. And after the changes in the 1st of April, we had to resubmit this for a fire test. Okay. Now, it typically goes from the external side of the roof, board, membrane, roof tile. Okay. So we now have to choose which roof membrane we're going to test the slate with.
Yes.
Okay. So there's over 300 roof membranes on the market. So we have to choose one. Right. Okay. So we already know that a lot of our customers are relatively allergic to systems. So now we're going to be absolutely specific. You can only use this membrane. Okay, with this thing. So what did we do first off? We tried testing it without any membrane at all, because then you can use any membrane you like, because it's not going to make it any worse. Okay, but at £4,000 to £5,000 a pop for each test. Okay, how many tests are people going to do? So you can imagine that all the different configurations have effectively created a who's got the most money, the most robust distribution. They win, everybody else can bugger off. Okay,
yes.
Then the next cup of gasoline on here on the fire is building control and enforcement, because it's completely and utterly incapable of policing the system. Okay, so you have on paper compliance and on site non-compliance. Yeah, and it might be through ignorance. I mean, what do we do about it, Charlie? What does it seems to me very much as though this whole set of regulations, this whole regulatory process is going to have a vast array of unintended consequences.
Yeah, well, that's what happens when you only have one. When you take a very complex interdisciplinary system and you basically say, well, right now, because there's been a tragedy, and let's absolutely not like shy away from that. Like Grenfell was an absolute disaster on so many levels and a systemic failure, right? But you don't take an incredibly complex system and say there's been a systemic failure in this area, and therefore we have to shift the entire system to solve that one problem, because there's many other problems that it's all trying to deal with. So I think what's going to happen is that they're going to let it run for a couple of years, if that, and they're going to have to go back and completely rethink it because it's clearly non-workable. I don't know who was in the room when it was designed. Clearly the architects weren't in there and the building designers weren't in there, because there's no way you would design that system from where we're sitting, the kind of liability that's being pushed onto architects and designers. I don't know anyone who is going to be able to design high-risk buildings from where they sit. Like, we will never design a high-risk building. So that's something over 18 meters and more than two flats. We'll never get there now. Like, they've locked out everyone from innovating and coming in and trying new things, as far as I can see.
I have a friend who works for a well-known bookies. He's an actuary. He sets odds. And I've been talking about this for a while, about fire safety. And I said to him, what are the odds of dying in a house fire, do you think?
Well, this is another whole area, isn't it?
But I mean, let's have a quick meander into it, because it's the reasoning. So I kept on hearing at events that I went to that fire safety was what was driving all of this. Grenfell was a tragic, massively unfortunate corruption of the data, because a single number of people tragically died in one incident. The trend had been downwards for a very, very long time for the number of people who died in house fires. And he worked out that actually the best way to do this, I should go down to my local William Hill and put 10 quid on me dying in a house fire, okay, and get odds of 22 million to 1, which is, staggeringly big odds, okay? And that's my pension. That's it's an invitation to my wife to burn the house down with me in it. If I die in a house fire, my wife gets 22 million quid. Okay, or 220 million quid in this case. It was 10. So I said to him, so why is insurance? Why are we all designing buildings like this and the insurance costs going up? He said he said it's a guess, but he said probably it's the rebuilding cost. It's disruption and rebuilding. So because it can't really be just driven by deaths, by injuries and deaths, because they've been consistently declining since the 1950s.
I mean, that's the thing that I find sort of very odd, and actually we're beginning to really understand what happened at Grenfell, and we understand that there was some very bad behavior throughout the system, undoubtedly. I don't think that's a question, but the response, I read a stat the other day that all high-risk buildings now need to go through Gateway 1 to get to planning, Gateway 2 to start construction. Less than 10% of buildings are getting through Gateway 2, and I checked that just before I jumped online, because apocryphally I've been speaking to a couple of people. I know a guy who's got a 7-hectare site in central Birmingham. He can't get one of his buildings through Gateway 2. I was speaking to someone who works for a very large, I think she's got 4,000 units trying to be built in London. They can't get anything through Gateway 2. To the point that inner city house builders are now going, we can't build in these inner city places. Let's all start looking at the countryside, because at least we might be able to get things up, because we don't have through the gateway system. Now we've got a very real housing crisis, where people are definitely dying through poor quality housing. It is definitely costing the NHS a huge amount of money through poor quality housing. It is definitely costing the social services a huge amount of money through poor quality housing. But the problem is there isn't a definitive 0 and 1 on that. It's a grayscale. So our system is so sort of poor at understanding that complex, siloed thinking that's not on the spreadsheet, that, actually poor quality housing, somebody doesn't do as well as they should do at school, and therefore they don't make the taxes they should, they don't become the sort of active member of society they should. There's no way of tracking that. I mean, they did some work in Wales where they thought poor quality housing there cost £1 billion per year to their economy, beyond the kind of house stuff, like the wider costs, and it was a 4-to-1 return on investment. So I get it, right? I 100% get it. 72 people, I think it is, sorry, I've got the number wrong, died in the most horrendous way, and it has to be we have to do what we can to make it not happen. But where I start to not understand is trying to do everything where that can never happen. It's just not realistic.
I don't know that you can regulate corporate culture. And the other thing with this is, I wonder what any of the regulatory team are going to say when the first building gets built to the new compliance and there's a fire and someone dies in it.
Well, you just can't rule it. It's not possible. You can't get rid of that risk.
When you talk to architects and building designers, they'll tell you that making a building safe is pretty much about design. Materials matter, but it's pretty much about design. You can design buildings which give people means of escape. You can design buildings to do all sorts of things. Survive earthquakes, for goodness sake. So it's an interesting topic, but I just think one of the things it highlights is that how, especially in very large ecosystems, things can get hijacked for the wrong reason. Yeah. Okay, and a lot of it is hijacked through ignorance. I think there's a wonderful Nassim Taleb, if you've ever come across him, who's a Lebanese economist, a Lebanese American economist, wrote lots of books. One of which was Black Swan, about game-changing events. The other one was called Skin in the Game. His definition of an expert is somebody that will take responsibility for their actions. So you can't call yourself an expert in something if you're not fully accountable. Therefore, most consultants and a lot of people in the construction sector are not experts. A plumber is. They come around to your house and fix your tap.
Yeah.
It leaks and it floods the flat below. They're accountable. They're an expert. Okay, they made a mistake. But there are too many people who can hide in our business, And
I think that's partly why, going back to this question of why does circularity not happen? Why did we not change? It's because people aren't prepared to do the hard work to understand, go into the gray areas where it isn't all tested and literally you're just ticking boxes and, ordering online shopping for your building. You're actually designing something and taking the time to trial it and look at it and make some judgments. That's, I think, where there's a lack. And I think it really worries me that we're pushing away from it. If that's how, that's one phrase of it, of sort of expert culture, literally just into online shopping. And I don't know whether, and then I think you end up with corporate responsibility at that point. I don't think it's any safer.
Well, I think,
I just think there's an illusion of safety there that people are more comfortable to shoulder, just to brush off risk.
It's because there is a culture of adopting a defensible position.
Yeah.
As your primary job function is to defend your position. It's in layman's terms, not get fired, okay, or not get sued. I mean, it's an interesting one because it ties in with another thing. That's one of the things I've heard you raise on a number of occasions, which is about meaningful regulation, about the quality of regulation. In particular, I've heard you talk about this in terms of waste and carbon, but I think and end of life design. I think, would it be fair to say that you think that the innovation should principally be market-led rather than regulatory driven?
I don't have a one-word answer for that, but I did read about something recently.
We've got plenty of time.
But I read something recently that was really fantastic. Like Amsterdam is trying to become a circular city by 2050, right? And they've made some incredible steps. They're trying to reduce like new building materials or half new building materials into the city by 2030. They try to half energy consumption by 2035. They're really going for it. And what they did is they started something like 200 projects. They just sort of said, we want to become a circular city. Here's some money and opportunity to try stuff. 100 of them garbage, 50 of them all right, 25 of them pretty good, 20 of them good, 5 of them extraordinary. And I think so. I think it needs both, right? It needs the legislation, it needs the government, it needs those in control to take risk and create sticks and carrots to make people change, but it needs the market to be allowed to innovate and try new things and evolve and be the weird kind of organism that clearly, the dinosaur that was always going to die, that died out, and the other one that always going to become the amazing, survival species. And that's what we need. So I don't think it's like a binary thing, but I think relying on either to solve the problem is massively problematic.
I think it fits with your description earlier on of this being enormously complex. I think one of the things that is missing in this, that we encounter as a merchant, is the bit in the middle, which is effectively how customers think. So, I mean, very obvious things is customers are not going to know anything about something they don't know about. So getting them to know about is important. But what I would call demand pull is probably more effective for change than demand push. So, we on the one hand, we look left and we see suppliers take this product, we've developed this, we've tweaked this, we've done whatever, take it and sell it into the market. On the other hand, we've got customers saying, these are the problems that I want to solve. Typically, they're cheaper, faster, So, but the other thing that intrigues me about this is because it's such a complex system, you have various players and stakeholders in it have various exit points, and they'll maximize their profit to their point of exit, to the extent that often there's no care, as long as they've done their job to the point of exit with profit and are compliant with the consequences of what they leave for others. Okay, so you end up with this where the poor person at the end who's occupying the house that they've commissioned you to design and have built, not necessarily with you, Charlie, but they're the ones who bear the brunt of all these aggregated mistakes, or so
yes. I think quite often they do.
So how do you when you, because your projects, I mean, you haven't got where you sound like CJ off whatever, you haven't got where you are today without, you've obviously managed to address this issue of feeding this sort of line of responsibility through the jobs that you do, so that people have an understanding of the baton that they're getting and the baton they're handing on. Okay, without the client ending up at the end with just being handed the keys. There you go. Yeah. You might not encounter that because you probably don't you don't build in a way that exposes that necessarily.
No, look, you're trying to bring several 100,000 objects together in the right time, at the right place, in the right order, at the right cost. I mean, that never happens perfectly. I think one thing I would say is that we try and stand up and take responsibility for any issues that arise, that we are very careful about who we work with. We try and work with the same teams and have built teams over many years. We have started quite small and had the ability to grow quite slowly and go from an extension to a house to a bigger thing to a bigger thing to a to bigger. We're only at sort of £3 or £4 million projects. I mean, they're not huge at this scale. I think the next step up is another leap. But actually, by doing that and really working with people that we trust, I think it's been a core part of what we do, so that there is skin in the game, because there's a relationship between us and them, and we want to carry on working with them. So I do think those things exist, and I think specifically, actually, that's really helpful. Like when you have a consultant or anyone in that chain of responsibility is sort of locked into it, then they'll go the extra yard, and they'll go, but they'll ask the awkward question, because they know that in the long run, if they don't do that, they might lose this opportunity to work again, and a good supply of work. So I think we're all doing that all the time, aren't we? Right. But and I think the problem is that legislation, it's very hard to legislate for that. And I think actually it's very hard to really test that the system is working well to the point of delivery of the house. And I think there's something very interesting about an airtightness test. Actually, I think it's probably the most interesting thing that happens in a building program. Two really interesting things. One is airtightness test, and the second one is when you then get your first year's energy and water consumption. I think those are two fantastically interesting moments in it, because they really tell you about your team and what's going on. And I mean all of the team. So I think, there is a way in which you could create legislation that understands the sort of integrated nature of the system and actually tries to pick out some key pressure points to look at more seriously. And I personally, I think airtightness is a great one, and going back and doing post-occupancy analysis, and that should be a part of your building regulations, and it would drive out so much poor behavior. I think it would be quite untrue. So it's the performance gap stuff, which I've sort of jumped. I have read these questions before, listeners, I'm being honest, and I've sort of brought that one up the table because I think it's a really interesting one. Sorry, I'm breaking the codes here, but
stick with it, because the performance. So I've read, as you have read, as many of the people who are going to listen to this have read, sort of the most monstrously, that's got to be a typo error.
Yeah, you can't believe it.
What do you mean 70% worse than design?
Well, I thought it was 100 for housing. I thought it was about 200 for officers, and like 300. Yeah, and 300 for schools and like institutional public-facing buildings or something insane like that. Now, they're probably slightly less than that, but they are that magnitude out.
I remember it was Ben Adam Smith's wonderful TV program called The Future of Housing, where this astonished, lovely lady who owned a new house basically said in a sort of Beryl Reid sort of way, that should be illegal, when she was told just how badly her house was performing and it had been signed off by building control, and it had sort of sneaked in on all compliance levels. Just expand on the performance gap. I mean, I mean, I tell you where we're heading with on the list of topics that I knew we wanted to talk about was whether or not this kind of building is a preserve of a certain type of person. But let's go back to performance gap. When you measure your buildings, how do you fare with your buildings on the performance as designed, built as designed front? Is your gap relatively small?
Yeah, yeah. The last couple we've done have been about like 10%.
So that could be excused entirely on the basis of occupant behaviour.
Yeah, I think so. And actually, the one before that was actually bang on. I mean, if anything, it was slightly under but he was a very engaged occupier, but it was actually under the PHPP sort of projected, energy and use sort of figure. But he was very engaged, and he was a self builder. I think that's a really good way to get an engaged occupier.
That's the ultimate skin in the game, isn't it?
Oh yeah. Guess what? All the problems go away if the person who built the house is the one living with it and they've really thought it through. And oh yeah, but let's not do that in this country. Let's have self-build rates of 5% in England and 7% in the UK, which is 4 times less than the next lowest, which is at Holland at about 25%. Oh yeah, let's not get people involved in making their own houses because there's far too much money to be made in it, and let's just give it to the corporates to do that.
Many years ago, I did a little graph. I think it was for the Green Register at the time, which basically one of the questions started with the question is why do so many of the materials that we use in the UK that are quote unquote sustainable come from overseas? What I did was I looked at all the countries from which we buy, and then I looked at all those countries' rates of self-built.
Yeah, of course.
And guess what?
Yes. Guess what?
UK less than 10% and probably 1% of the sustainable building materials. France, Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, all really high, and that's where a lot of these come.
Well, yeah, Austria's at 80% or something.
80%.
Self-build rates, and it's been something that's really sort of exercised me for 20 years is the low levels of self-build rates, and nothing has changed. And I suspect it's not going to change anytime soon with the 1.5 million target for new build housing that Labour have sort of announced. And it's just this idea that if you have 60% of the houses built by 8 companies with 8 sort of innovation officers, chiefs, or whatever they're called, I don't know what they're called, but I imagine there's 8 probably blokes, maybe not all, but nearly all blokes sat in rooms that just say, get that, buy that. Guess what? Not much stuff that's new gets made.
And I suppose the other thing that comes into here is client expectation. I think let's just tackle this one directly. Are the kind of buildings that you build and a lot of the people we supply onto simply the preserve of the affluent middle classes, the aspirational middle classes?
Well, I don't think so, because I really think that there is a very useful sort of rule of thumb, a really good heuristic, that if you can genuinely drive down embodied carbon, you will drive down cost, right? So we're doing life cycle carbon analysis on our buildings now, and I think life cycle carbon analysis is probably one of the most exciting things in building that is happening at the moment, right? I know, like, what are you talking about, you loser? But I'll explain why. It's fantastic when you do life cycle carbon analysis, in that you get a whole 60 years of what the building is going to use. Now, it's a 60-year thing. There's a few things that are a bit weird about it. Like, so you build it, you run it for 60 years, you maintain it, you replace stuff, and then you take it down. And it tells you how much carbon is going to be sort of produced in that process. And what you start to see is just things like just quite how much carbon there is in replacement of and refurbishment of the building as it's built. Okay. So when you do that, you suddenly start to see your buildings in terms of time over 60 years, like the fourth dimension, like, because buildings are not static things. And I think we've got a very static idea that a building just sort of sits there, it's built and it's there, and then 100 years it does things, but they're really not. They're constantly changing. And so what looks like a great decision in the first place, like, let's get that cheap single ply roof and get it on there. And it's like, half the price, it's got a 15-year lifespan. But when you put that in your life cycle carbon analysis, suddenly the cost of that and the carbon associated replacing that 4 times pretty much over 60 years becomes, or having 4 of them over 60 years looks like a really bad decision. Whereas maybe like a 3-layer felt that, yes, has more carbon when it goes in, but has a 30, 40-year life cycle. You're getting 2 of them. suddenly it like changes the decisions that you're making. So it makes that thing of like buy well and buy once, that old, that old adage of, it gives it the numbers, because people flipping love numbers, to actually justify some genuinely smart decision making. And if you've got a problem there of short-term finance, but over 60 years, there's money to be made. Well, now that becomes a finance problem. And actually, finance people are really smart, and the city's really smart. Surely we can find a way of financing people to put better quality products in that are going to save money over life cycle. Now, we're not there yet, but that makes me think I can see how we get to a sustainable building culture. And I think the way we get to a sustainable building culture, because everyone says it's driven by the buck, is through long-term in life cycle analysis.
I think that when you look at how things have happened, say, in certain financial services like pensions, getting people to contribute into pensions, which is surrendering money they could have used elsewhere, which worked. Again, it's about how you incentivize people. I'm sure there must be a system somewhere where effectively you could get a tax break for a building that behaved better in long-term carbon terms, even if it changed hands. You bought this house, it's past its 50 year, so this year you get a tax credit of this, because you've effectively saved money over these.
But even if you then carbon and also cost. So and also and they're this, we assume they're very similar, which I think they are. Then there is this real opportunity that we can work at pace and with some smart thinking to try and incentivize this kind of new insight into the way things work. It's almost like going forward to go backwards, of like, just do it properly. Just do it once and do it properly. It might cost a little bit more, but actually it's massively cheaper over the long-term life cycle of this building. And we have to think in building terms of time, not in, human terms of time. That's where the clash comes.
So I think,
the immediate owner and profit-driven motive of time.
Well, I think that's the bit I was just going to mention, because if you're a developer, you're building to sell, you're not going to occupy the house.
Yes.
And if you look at the numbers, and it's a while since I've done it, but the number of people, the frequency with which people move changes in number of years. I think currently the average is something like 17 years. It's quite a lot. Okay.
Is it? I thought it was 8. It was like, depends where you are. 10, 15 years ago, it was 8 years. So yeah, that's really changed.
What you need to do is you need the benefits to be able to be acquired, and then the benefit to continue with the new owner of the house. But I mean, the more I think about it, and we've been talking to various mortgage companies, I'll mention that to them, but some kind of carbon rebate would be a sensible idea to help motivate people to put the quality up front, because there's a long-term benefit from it.
So just to take on from that, so we're doing a headquarters for an ethical investment. They wouldn't call themselves that, but they're an ethical investment firm. And we are driving the costs down to around £3,400, £3,500 a square metre all in, right? When we did our office here, which is an old steel barn, we refurbished it and we did all the landscape because we're offsetting the carbon from building it into the landscape. It's about 75 tonnes over 60 years. We think it would take about 20 years to drive that into the land remediation that we're doing with planting and wildflower, right? We did this at the time it was £1,650 a square metre, probably now about £2,200, £2,300 a square metre. I mean, super cheap. Like the running costs are nothing. And actually, because we reused lots of stuff, because we're looking at circular economy, like I can go and get toilets for a tenner, secondhand toilets coming out of office buildings being stripped out in London for like 10, 15 quid. They're like 3-year-old toilets. Like they're absolutely mint. Do you know what I mean? So they're cheaper and there's no carbon. We're using upturned railway sleepers for all the external paving. They're about 14 quid each. They work out at about 20 quid a square metre, 30 quid a square metre laid for really long lasting external paving that's not going to crack and lift because they're heavy. And that's cheaper and there's no carbon. And in 30 years time, you can just lift them up and use them for someone else. So there genuinely is a way you can make it cost effective. It shouldn't be the preserve of the wealthy or the engaged, but it does require a real clarity and simplicity of design thought and a rigor of design thought, right? That you just have to really understand what you're trying to do, which is building affordably doesn't mean building badly or boringly. It means building efficiently, okay? And again, that doesn't have to be boring or bad. You have to have that in your mind.
It's a shame there isn't a sort of opposite end of the market, but equally well done program for grand designs, which is sort of, not bog standard, but just accessible designs.
Yeah, and this just strikes me, that's where the awards area and all the building awards and architecture awards, it strikes me that that's sort of what they should really be celebrating to a large extent, or not.
You have a
without
problem
exception.
with awards, Charlie?
No, I do. I remember sitting at the Sterling Prize years ago, and all these pictures coming up, and this picture I couldn't even work out what it was, and everyone just going ooh in the audience. It's like, what is it? It's just an image. That's not how you consume a building. And what's it going to look like in 5 years? I mean, I think it's going to look terrible. What's it going to look like in 10 years? It'll probably be ripped out in 10 years. So I do have a problem that buildings are not a momentary. It's that thing of like, I think awards make us think of buildings as static things, and they're not static things. They are very dynamic. They're mid of a massive amount of flow of energy and people and waste and materials coming in, going out, and food and sewage, and they're a dynamic system. And to sort of lock them down into a series of images and then give gongs out for that, I think is really problematic.
I'm going to join in the rant. My little one is try going to a butcher and not seeing a little signpost somewhere, a little poster on the wall that says award-winning sausages. It's just devaluing
a lot of awards.
Massive.
But they're equally a really good way of celebrating and celebrating, which is important, and spreading learning. And so I do think that some sort of awards about, they should be in cost. They should be like value bundles, up to £1,200, £1,500 square meter, 2,000, and then you understand that, if you're Norman Foster's building the Bloomberg headquarters, I mean, he wins Sterling Prize every flipping time he turns up because his buildings are so expensive.
Heath and Sons, our local butcher, I like their sausages. The fact that they've won an award matters not one jot to my choice of sausages. I just like their sausages. Okay, they can have 10 awards; it make no difference. I just think that. So what we're kind of heading towards here really is looking at how you get greater penetration for this kind of building methodology. And I've been at this for years now, and it's a bloody struggle, Charlie. It really is. It's not. You can talk to people who are going to have buildings built for them. So either we're non-construction professionals, and it all seems eminently sensible. And then when you say something like you can have it for £2,600 a square metre or £3,100 a square metre, they go, actually that fits our budget, multiplied up, etc. But they're not in charge of this. What they're in charge of is buying a house built by someone else to standards which they are told are at the zenith of building, but are actually compliant only. So where compliance acts as effectively as a ceiling, okay, that's where people stop. And so why we don't have a culture of building to a much higher standard in this country, It beggars belief that we've ended up with such a low level of compliance. But that's the regulatory framework we're in, and that's where people end. That's what they're aiming for. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is changing slightly. It is changing. I tell you what does give me hope in this is sort of office space. And talking, we were doing some work on an office project in London recently, and talking to the rental sort of guys and the letting agents, and they said it's quite interesting. Central London now, a lot of those companies, they don't show me anything that's not A rated and doesn't have all of the amazing standards, and because their employees want it. And so that actually, there is actually a place there where they're going well beyond minimum standards, because I think there's two reasons. One, their kind of young employees or their employees are saying, well, if you want us to come to the office, it better be bloody nice. Otherwise, I'm not coming to it. I'll go I'll go to another one. And actually, what I think people have understood is that when you look at the life cycle cost of an office building, because I want to go back at this again, 80 to 90% of it is wages. Like building the building is 3% of the life cycle cost of an office building. So if you can get that 3% to get your 90% to be a little bit 10% more efficient, I mean, it's just it's like 1,000% return on investment. So they've got it. And actually the fact that system, that market has quite quickly moved, I sort of feel that there is actually achievable change within the standards that people accept and want their housing to be. I really believe there is achievable change that can be made with the right levers.
I think that's
And
a
that's
demand.
a regulatory.
It's partly demand driven as well, because I think post COVID, I mean, so many people have got used to working from home now and working remotely.
Yeah.
That I think if I was going, I mean, I'm in a different building. I'm in a grade 1 listed building where we're in the stable block where our office is, and so there's. But I think if I had to go into the big smoke into a nice office, I think to attract your people back in, then I can kind of see there's more than one motivator with this.
But also you can see that having to work from home and having to pay your electricity bill or your gas bill when you're working from home and heat your house during the week, you suddenly go, that's actually costing me a fortune to sit at home because my house is really not very efficient. So therefore,
I think that realization we did notice that realization that people, especially during COVID, during the colder months, were suddenly thinking, blimey, I'm actually at home during the day. This is bloody cold during the day. Yeah.
Or my bills are really quite high.
Or why are my bills high? Because I've left the thermostat on 23. And actually, and I've got, or the windows are drafty or whatever. The other area I think where we're seeing as well, we see significant progress being made and leadership being shown is in housing associations.
Yeah.
Is social housing. So you've kind of got at the one end, you've got this sort of leaning towards higher, families or individuals with higher disposable income who are motivated to do so. And at the other end, you've got the necessity driven by long-term ownership and what that exposes you to, which really helps. So you've got this great big whacking chunk in the middle. Okay. And, so much of it is in our village where I live on the south coast, as you know, but locally to us, if you want to stay local to your family, you've got to buy local. And if all the land's been bought up by developers and and developers are building little rabbit hutches on them for 400 grand each, that's what you've got to buy if you can afford it. I mean, the affordability thing as well is another one. This is affordability as well, which is one thing we've been interested to talk to mortgage companies about, is how can you lend to people who have long-term commitment to make houses, so you can actually get into a house, which is better. And should we be saying to the mortgage companies, you need to be a little bit more discerning? In other words, if you have a better performing house that's more durably built, then you.
But it's not even about being. I've never understood that one. There's a couple of points there. One, I think the idea that you're responsible for the energy efficiency of your house ongoing is absolutely critical to it. I think it's the first piece of legislation that has to happen. So that's that post occupancy analysis piece. And if you don't meet it, then you as a developer are responsible for rectifying it to what you claimed.
Do you think they could regulate that? Is that what you're
absolutely
suggesting?
Yeah, no problem. I'm sure they could regulate it. It's because it's very clear. Like we can go back and say, can you send us all your bills?
So you have a sort of leakage fine. If your building leaks this much, you get fined this much. Yeah.
And you have to rectify it. And that's very expensive because where are you putting the people? So suddenly if you make the penalty for lack of compliance so high, guess what? They will see that all the insulation is properly done. They will change the insulation they're using, so they're not trying to use rigid boards and cavities that have massive thermal bypass, and they'll blow insulation. They'll do all the stuff that we're doing because that's how you guarantee performance, right? And if you don't and you have to go back, they won't. It's so expensive. The second thing is, I never understood it with mortgage companies, why when they look at your ability to pay, it isn't your sort of mortgage payments and your energy costs bundled into one. And that should be the ceiling. So suddenly, if they could do that, and your mortgage and your energy costs were all bundled into one bit of what you can afford to pay, suddenly buying a house that has less energy costs means you can buy a more expensive house. So why then wouldn't the builders build more energy performing houses? Because they're actually selling a more expensive product and they're making a percentage on the build cost and the sale of the house. So it all feels to me like with some simple realignment, all this stuff could actually push in one direction.
There's another thing going on here as well, which is I think people have a tendency, whether you're an individual or a family or a couple, to work out how much you can borrow and then spend the full amount on a house.
Yeah.
Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could work out the maximum you could borrow and think, actually, for 20 grand under that, we could get a house that would suit us and do for us. Okay, but this is sort of slightly strange, but it's just partly, I think it's driven by the prices. There were some houses that went up near us. They were finished last year, and I was absolutely appalled to see a big sign at the entrance to the estate saying 2, 3 and 4 bedroomed houses from £400,000. Now, if you're on a relatively modest income, if you work as a nurse or as a gardener, or you have even if you've got a partner who does the same, that's an absolutely enormous amount of money to find.
Well, it's quite interesting. And what's driving that? I read a really interesting report recently that was talking about profit levels of the large house builders. And it cites the large, I won't name names in case I get the figures wrong and I get a cool tap on the shoulder from a man in a suit. But it talked about profit levels of 25 to 32% on deployed income, right? It is utterly extraordinary that we have allowed a system to be created where that is an acceptable level of profit on the action of designing and building and planning and buying houses. It just beggars belief. When those levels in Europe, now traditionally they always said the levels here were 20% and they were 10% in Europe. Well, if they're at 25, 30%, maybe they've gone up to 40 or 50% in Europe. I don't know. I'd be surprised, but maybe they have. So it's quite crazy that we clearly have a system that is driving so much profit out of the building process that people have to become second and the quality has to become second, that we've allowed it to happen. And unfortunately, by citing the 1.5 million target as a pre-election sort of gambit, they've locked themselves into this sort of death spiral.
They have, and it's
how are you going to change that? You can't, because they're reliant on them to deliver in this parliament. If they'd said we're going to deliver 300,000 by fourth, fifth year of the next parliament, we spend the next 3 or 4 years completely rewiring what we know is a broken housing system. Guess what? The big house builders would have come to the table and said, what can we do differently? How do we change this? But they didn't.
Have to go back to the coalition to see the paper that they produced called Broken Housing Market, where they published on the broken house. I worked in Bavaria for some time on renewable energy, and one of the things that really impressed me down there about their developer market is local town decides wants to expand, wants new houses, so they get together with the local lands bank and the planning authority and they design what they want. Then they go to the constructors and say, pitch to build this, and then they have to build it and they have to warranty the buildings for 20 years. Okay, so it's locally funded, locally done. Whereas what happens in the UK is exactly the opposite, which is developer buys land speculatively, at some point pitches up and goes, we're going to put 32 houses an acre on this, and we're going to sell them for £500,000 each. And this is what you get to choose, guys. Yeah. And then you spend years and years and years with the local people trying to block the planning application until eventually it gets through and they get what they don't want.
Yeah. And they fight about no for yes and no for so long that they never ask the question, what should yes look like? It's quite interesting, so we've just done a housing project here in Hook Norton where I live, which was 12 houses for the community-led CLT project. And that process of working with people to say, so we started off going, because we've had 160 new houses in this village, and we asked the village, do you want new housing? And they said, and we have got a brewery, so we have got a brewery to live there. we said, what would you like us to look at? Because we have a low carbon group, and we said, do you want to look at all these different options? And housing came out like 82% of people said housing. We literally couldn't believe it. With all the new housing, they wanted housing because the housing we've been given is not what we wanted. So then we went on a 5-6 year journey, building these houses, creating CLT and going through all the incredible hoops that we're forced to go through, the complexity of it to build these housing. And it's been really interesting. And we ask people questions like, do you want surely you want like the little house with a garden all around it and the car park, or you could have shared car parks, you could have terraces because they're cheaper to build, cheaper to run, and we could have parking yard and shared space. And actually the houses look so different from what developers are building. It makes you realize all we fight about is yes and no. We never actually get to what should yes look like and what do people want yes to be. And it's not just Bavaria, it's exactly the same thing in Holland. It's exactly the same thing across Europe. The municipality and the people decide the housing they need, and then they pitch to builders to build it. And they're builders, not land speculators. And that's what our house builders, as they're called, are.
We're getting on in this conversation. We've got a little time left. But
I think we just got over ranty, so I apologise.
No. Listen, the whole point about thinking aloud is that it's ranty. It's
I thought it was thinking loud. That's why I've been shouting. I misread the title. I'm just so on the CLT side of it. So CICs are the same, but collaborative engagement and shared interest are one of the driving mechanisms that we don't use. It's one of the things that housing associations do have, which is a shared
shared outcomes, shared interest. It's in everybody's interest to fix one problem. The beneficiaries are other people for you behaving that way. I just think that are we just going to end up blaming developers for everything? Because I think we probably are. But it's again, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, which is about measuring stuff. If you have a what gets measured gets done mentality, then there are consequences if you measure wrong or you don't measure at all. Okay, and I just think that one of the things that you get more comprehensive measuring in a collaborative organisation like a
Yes.
CFC. Do you think, the question I've got is do we, because I was intrigued when I went to I can't name names because I'm going to get myself into trouble. There was about, I don't know, maybe 1,000 people on this Zoom call, and it was a well-known brand of material within the construction sector, and it was a whole seminar on collaborating. And one of the people who was on there had behind them all the different logos of all the organisations they've been working with. They didn't recognise one of them. Okay, and you just think, who are all these bloody people? What this is adding cost to the whole construction sector, and we don't even know who you all are. I just wonder whether all of this crap can be cut out to a large extent by adopting more collaborative and cooperative models.
Yeah, I think it's two things I want to say to that. One is I don't just blame the developers. I think that's ridiculous. That's like blaming a mugger, for example, for all the ills of society. It's not. There's a reason that they've turned to that way of behaving, and the system has made them behave like that, and they're exploiting what they see as an opportunity. That's all developers are doing, and I think you're not going to solve the problem by just blaming them. There has been a tacit collusion between people not wanting housing, between the focus of land ownership into such few people's, few people having so much land ownership, the government not willing to grab the nettle, successive governments not grabbing the nettle about how we build and who we build for. And all these people are doing is exploiting that system and leaning on the levers that they've been given by that system historically to increase the size of their wealth, and you can't blame them. On one level, I think I can say that I don't agree with it. I think it's appalling, but I think to blame them doesn't solve the problem.
No, I agree. Shareholder value is driven by these businesses are driven by shareholder value and compliance.
Yeah, which unfortunately we know that corporate shareholder value does not bring well-being and it doesn't prioritize well-being and happiness to wider society. No. And I think of all the kind of businesses that are operating in our societies, I think house builders should be about bringing happiness and health and well-being to society, not profit. But that's another question. So I think you're absolutely right. I think collaboration is really interesting. I genuinely feel that building regulations, apart from I understand fire, you need to understand what's going into the building. But I do think the whole energy thing of how you build and what you build and how it works, you could get rid of that by just putting some monitoring in every house that's built, and seeing if there's moisture problems, seeing if there's deflection, seeing if they're producing enough energy. Focus on outcome, not process. And as soon as you do that, the market self-regulates. So and that's on pretty much everything we've talked about today is if you focus, and it's not expensive to model and monitor buildings, right? In so many ways, because technology is so cheap now and a small internet connection is really simple. You can monitor everything. So you could actually just reduce so much of the building reg stuff around thermal and energy efficiency to just saying, you do it. If it complies with these things, you're fine. And if it doesn't, you put it right. And guess what? The system would completely change in terms of collaboration, I suspect.
I suppose, yeah, I mean, it's interesting. You do. It might be worth just a quick sort of last touch on this. Well, two things really. The collaborative thing. I'm absolutely certain that the majority of building professionals that I engage with would be more than happy if there were some options and some slightly more straightforward ways to work collaboratively.
Yes. And
I just think that they tend to be that kind of people. So I'm not quite sure where in the system it gets let down, but it's certainly an ambition that I would like everyone to take on board and to be promoted. I'm not sure that we do enough as a sector to do that. I think that, go back to my point earlier on about people's exit. You do your bit, and kind of you can see it if you're an absolute specialist. You're going to go in and do one job and leave. But I just think that there's that extended ownership is something that we should encourage. I wanted just to very quickly touch with you on technology before we wrap this up. And so we've seen everything from sort of AI making it smart. We've seen lots of different changes in the way we've got digital twins as well now, so you can model offsite. Do you use any of these systems
Yes. Yeah,
within
we're
your
using a
practice,
lot of,
and how?
yeah. Yeah, so we use a lot of thermal modeling. We're starting to use a lot of carbon modeling. And with the carbon modeling, like, I'm banging on about it being it's perfect. It really is not perfect. I do not believe that the output that you get of like the kilograms or the tons per life cycle are accurate. I'm not sure that they are particularly accurate. There's too much data at the moment. There's too much data uncertainty. There's too few certification on it. But what I think where we use it increasingly and really, really helpfully is relative carbon. So if we smash out the concrete floors and put in a new limecrete floor, what's the carbon? What's the life cycle saving? We're doing a building recently where we're like, the first thing we're like, right, whack on 300 mil of engineered I-beams on the outside, blow it with some wood fiber. That's bound to be the best thing. Or do we put 240 mil continuous wood fiber, or do we put 240 mil I-beams and blow it with wood fiber? And actually, we all thought, well, 300 more insulation. The 240 is by far better in terms of carbon, and actually not taking out the concrete floor is far better in terms of carbon payback and life cycle carbon. So we use that to challenge and train ourselves.
When
and
did you start using this? Because when was the point when you couldn't do it, and when was the point that you could? I'm presuming this is software driven when you do this. Or
it's software driven. Yeah. So we've done it about the last 3.5 years, the carbon modeling, but we were doing it outside of the practice, and there was just and it was great, but there was a disconnect from the kind of day-to-day design decisions and getting the information back to allow you to go get this move on. So we've started doing in-house as a sort of rough and dirty, using pH ribbon, a sort of rough and dirty to model decision making in-house. And then, if we need certification stuff at the end of it, we'll go and dump our bad home notes on the desk of someone who does it, day in, day out, and get them to rerun the modeling. But I think the test of whether this stuff is genuinely working is it helping you make better decisions? And is it helping you drive down cost? Another thing we do a lot of is do a lot of 3D modeling of our timber frames, and we're optimizing our timber frames, and we're using that to cut frames efficiently, and we're driving waste out of that process. So to a point that we got to a building recently where we'd designed all the timbers, and we engineer was happy, it was all going to stand up, everyone said that's done, and then one of the team spent another day just doing efficiency on the timber frame. They took out £4,000 worth of wood. And that's raw cost of the wood before it's been shipped, before it's been fitted, before it's been dealt with. And, so that's a much greater cost. So having a way of driving efficiency, both in terms of design decision and then the stuff that gets delivered to site, is, I think, having a huge impact on not only the performance, the carbon, but the cost of what we're doing. And I think that's when the technology is really working. So my test for technology is like, does it mean we're making a better building? And if the answer is yes, then we embrace it. Yeah, and like BIM's been a big one for us. We've gone to BIM for everything in the last couple of years, and we just, everything is in BIM, and it is extraordinarily efficient now.
I think so. I mean, and I'd love to talk to you about digital twins as well, especially extending beyond, so you can effectively have a replica of the building as it exists in your office. We're coming to the end of it. Charlie, it's been fantastic listening to you and chatting with you. I'm gonna do what I do with all my guests. I'm gonna ask you 3 questions.
Yes, okay.
I've got 3 questions, and I what they are, because it's unfair to spring them on you. But the first one I ask everybody is, have you got a good read?
Yes.
For those people who are interested in this, recommend a good read, article, book, whatever it happens to be.
So I read a book called Wabi Sabi: The Wisdom in Imperfection by Nobuo Suzuki recently.
Yeah.
I built my own house a few years ago, and halfway through it, I had this epiphany, which was that the one thing you will find in the search for perfection is insanity. And I just had to let go a little bit, right? And actually, this book just talks about Wabi Sabi, and you really understand that nothing is perfect, nothing is permanent, nothing is finished. And that has been an enormous sort of moment of sort of aligning a lot of the things that I felt that it's never going to be perfect. So don't, you've got to be brilliant, but it doesn't have to be perfect. It's one of the very few books I've got to the end of it, and I literally turned back and started reading on the first page. So I think for anyone in the design profession or building profession, It's really good to really good book.
Is
to
it?
read.
Give it in a minute. Give us the name and the author again. Is this book? Is this principally a book about how building is approached?
No, it's a philosophy. It's about Eastern philosophy. So wabi sabi is the Japanese or Buddhist kind of idea that things aren't perfect and celebrating imperfection. So they'll make a Japanese garden. There'll always be something wrong, like a leaf's cut too short, or something. It's never perfect because life is never perfect. And then when things start to age, nothing is permanent, right? And the fact that when your building needs to have some more work to be done to it, well, nothing is finished. So I found these incredibly satisfying, sort of, that someone had sort of beautifully brought it all together, and it gave me a real insight to wabi sabi, which I knew a little bit about. Like wonky cups and stuff is the kind of obvious outward sort of thing that people know about, but there is so much more to it.
I have heard this book, and I have others recommend it. Give us the title and the author again, Charlie.
Wabi Sabi: The Wisdom in Imperfection by Nobuo Suzuki.
Brilliant.
Get it.
Now
get it secondhand. Get it secondhand. Secondhand books are the way forward. World of Books. Go secondhand books. Always look for secondhand books first.
One piece of advice, something that maybe you wish you'd known earlier. I have a suspicion it might be what you've just said because you used the word epiphany. But
that's one. No, I tried to do a different one actually. It's really try to understand the real value of what you do.
Yeah.
Because I think, and sometimes what you're doing isn't that valuable, and so you negotiate from that position.
A disheartening moment.
It is. But honesty is incredibly important. If you can't be honest with yourself, who else can you be honest with? But sometimes what you're doing is incredibly valuable, and actually, therefore, you fight your own corner and you hold the line, and you get what you think is right to happen. And I think understanding that and valuing that is really important.
So the last one is, it's kind of the sort of winning mentality thing, really, but it's kind of a moment or a realization that changed your behavior. I mean, I hear lots of things from different people, but something that you do in your life that allows you to develop all these other sectors. It might be any number of things. With a couple of people I've had before, it's been things like, sort of going for walks, oddly enough, was one person I was talking to said, the way I center myself, that was the one behavioral change. I realized I needed 10 minutes a day for myself, or 20 minutes a day. So anything that, when you change from the learning phase to the delivering phase, what have you got something you want to pick out that was a sort of a defining moment?
I think like trusting other people that you work with, but being very, very, very aware that not everyone delivers, but when you find people that deliver, trusting them, right? And building an amazing team. The team here at CLD is wonderful, and it's something that we have very little people leaving. We have a very stable team, and I really trust them. And actually, that allows me to do this kind of stuff because I know what's going on next door is going to be brilliant. And actually, some people won't let go. They won't let go and trust other people. But it's like, well, then you're not trusting yourself because you've chosen that person. And that doesn't mean you're not interested, you're not involved, you're not looking at stuff, but really trusting people and empowering the people around you to work, because then the things you're trying to achieve, you can amplify, and you can work together. So I think that was a real moment.
And sorry, go on.
No, and no, that's fine. That's what we're saying.
But so just as a segue and to wrap this up, the one bit that really appeals to me about that is you've identified one of the few things that's utterly valuable you can't put on a spreadsheet. Yes. So if an accountant was to come and value your business, where do you put the trust column YM? Trust.
Well, I tell you where we put that in our spreadsheet is that we're in the process of becoming an employee ownership trust. So we are becoming an employee ownership trust. So we trust them that's what we're doing. In fact, we've got a meeting in an hour and a half to get
from one employee owned business to about to one B1. Welcome and well done. On that,
what is the kind of the sign of the employee owned business? There must be.
I don't know. We'll try and invent
come up with one.
Charlie, listen, it's been lovely having you on. Thank you so much for sparing an hour to talk to Thinking Aloud. That wraps it up for this edition, and we would like to thank everybody who's listened to this, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you.